Welcome to Draft Sickos on the No Ceilings NBA YouTube feed and podcast network. I'm your host, Maxwell Baumbach, and this is the show where we discuss everybody from the biggest of names to the deepest of sleepers. My guest today is from the Resball podcast. It is Steve Peltier. Steve, how are you doing tonight?
Oh, I'm doing good. Shout out Steven. I just saw the intro and saw Steven in the intro again. So shout out Steven Gillespie, wherever you are.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we're getting him back relatively soon. I never want to promise anything because I never know the exact specifics, but I've been talking to Steven a little bit. We should be getting him back soon. But yeah,
from one Steven to the other. Shout out.
Exactly. Really glad to have you on the pod. Love the work that you've done on the Resball podcast. If you guys aren't following along with that, make sure you are. As far as like other people discussing sicko content in this space, it's a go-to for me. Like there are so few other shows I can go to and be like, oh, finally, people talking about Magoon Gwath and people like that. So I love the work that you do over there. And like Jam Hines is like a mutual friend of ours. So longtime fan of the work that you do, and glad that we're finally getting you on the pod over here. This week, we have a really fun mix of players. We're going to be talking about Simas Lukosius. We're going to talk about Magoon Gwath. We are going to talk about Michael Rataj. And we're going to lead off talking about a guy that you brought up who Corey Tulaba at our site has been a fan of for a long time. I've always liked him. And I feel like every time I've dug into the data, I'm like, wow, I should like this guy even more. And then I just never have put in the work on him really until this week. And he's somebody that you brought up that you want to discuss on the show. That is Jacoby Gillespie, the Belmont transfer who is now at Maryland and having himself one heck of a season. A 6-foot-tall guard, but hey, pump the brakes because we're about to get into why that might not be an issue for Jacoby Gillespie. He is scoring 14.1 points per game, 51% from the field, 41.8% from three, 94.7% at the free throw line, averaging 3.2 assists to 1.3 turnovers and 1.5 steals per game. What has piqued your interest in Jacoby Gillespie and why I see somebody that you wanted to talk about on the pod today?
So I did an episode called The 6 Foot and Under Guard Bias, where I looked at a bunch of different guys in college, like Zakai Ziegler, like Josh Hubbard over in Mississippi State, who are under 6 feet, but like are super productive. And I was really trying to find one guy to pump up because 6-foot guards, everybody now is looking for Cade Cunningham. Everybody's looking for LaMelo Ball. Everybody's looking for Luka, right? But 6-foot guards haven't gone out of style. There's still Jose Alvarado out there. I mean, CP3 at my age, like 40 years old, is still out there doing his thing, right? The 6-foot guys don't go away because they still offer a lot of different skill set when it hits right. And the main thing with 6-foot guards is like, they can't finish very well. They don't play defense. You can't do anything with them. They got to be a really good 3-point shooter. And for Jacoby Gillespie, everything checks out right now. Like you said, 41% from three is what Jacoby Gillespie, 41.8. He's been a good 3-point shooter all his college career and a very good point of attack defender. That's one of the things I think is undersold on him. In the most recent game when Maryland played Purdue, I don't know why they went away from Jacoby guarding Braden Smith, because I feel like when Jacoby was guarding Braden Smith was uncomfortable. He really only hit one like deep three on Jacoby, and it's one of those deep threes that like, and a guy can hit that, like there's nothing you can really do about it. But when it was like Rodney Rice on him, that's when Braden kind of went bonkers and went off. So just pay attention to the guys when number 0 on Maryland is guarding them. Like he's in their grill and he disturbs them, which is definitely at 6 foot. Like think Jose Alvarado, think Fred VanVleet in the modern NBA. When you have a 6-foot guy that works, it's like that just makes people uncomfortable. Deuce over in New York as well. So another main reason why he's there. Javon Carter. I mean, I can go on and on. That's kind of the main calling card when you find a guy this small. But the main thing with Jacoby, last year, 76% at the rim. Every time with small guards. It's always, they can't finish well. And if he was like 60%, I would still make the argument. But when I saw 76%, and I said this on the pod, like how many starting centers, like on any team would want to shoot 76%? And why this isn't a stat that more people aren't like jumping on and like going bonkers over, I don't know. I can't remember the last time I saw any guard finish over 75% across a full season. He played a little bit less last year, but it was still over 90 shots. I think it was something like 76 of 91 last year at the rim. And right now, what do you know? I'm looking at his shot chart. Jacoby's 16 of 21, and he's shooting 76.2%. at the rim, and Maryland hasn't exactly played like a cookie schedule either. They played some tough guys.
Yeah, so like even in the half court, that number's at 68, which is like median outcome for like a center in a pre-draft season. Like that is elite finishing. So from a guard, like I just want to like put this into context. Like one of my favorite things to do is just like track data on what guys did in their pre-draft seasons. So like elite guard finishers are like the category that he would be in. Like the only guys that finished that effectively were like Halliburton, who never got to the rim. Lonzo Ball, who like also wasn't at the rim a lot. So just in terms of like rim pressure and rim finishing, it's like Gary Payton II. And like that's about it. Yeah, him, De'Aaron Fox, like Jaden Ivey, like those are the kind of guys that generally finish that well. So we're generally talking like mega athletes, which you kind of need to be if you're going to be a small guard. You need to either have like some level of like bounce or quickness or something to sort of compensate for that lack of size. And I think Jacoby has that. I think it's so important for like, I think speed in general is just sort of under discussed when it comes to guards. Like I don't recall the last time I was watching an NBA game and I was like, that guard is slow or like not nimble or shifty. You know what I mean? Like they just move differently than the guards that aren't in the NBA, or you watch a G League game. And like, even from the NBA to the G League, there's a pretty stark difference in terms of how the guards operate and move around the floor. And with Jacoby, like one of the notes I took last year during this time at Belmont is that everything with the ball in his hands is snappy and sudden. Like it just happens, whether he is going to the basket, whether he is stepping back, crossing over, whatever, it all happens so fast with him. And then you add in the fact that like, he's got this handle, he's got this footwork and this balance. Like it's really, really hard to stay in front of him or even stay on him. So it's like, okay, well, if you want to play him tight because he's a shooter, like the separation footwork is still there. And he's such a legit shot maker. Like when we're talking high percentage from three, it's now back-to-back years of like pretty high volume. 7.5 threes per 100 last year, 11.5 this year, and 38.7% last year, 41.8% this year. Like there is just not much to quibble with in terms of results behind the 3-point line or inside the arc, which is generally the bigger concern with a small guard. So it's like, I'm more optimistic about Jacoby than a lot of small guards. And I think so much of it is his ability to just get to his spots. Like as simple as it is, like whether he wants to get to a three or he wants to get to the basket, he's able to do it.
Yeah. And I mean, to me too, I look at how do you play well when you're up against the top teams? Like we said before, Maryland, they played Marquette. They played Villanova, who's okay. They played Ohio State. Boo, I'm a Michigan alum, so I have to boo them. Like, once you get the degree, you'd have to do it. And Purdue. So they played very good teams. Against Marquette, he dropped 24. Against Ohio State, he dropped 23. And against Purdue in the most recent game, he dropped 18. And oh, by the way, in those games, 4 of 9 from 3 against Marquette, 4 of 8 from 3 against Ohio State, and 4 of 7 from 3 against Purdue. So like the best games are against the best competition so far. And especially in the Marquette and the Purdue game, the quickness took them off guard. Like nobody could hang with him. And his crossover, Jacoby Gillespie's crossover, is lethal. Like when you're looking one way and he crosses you over, you blink and all of a sudden he's like a foot in front of you. Like there's nothing you can do to stop that kind of quickness. I mean, in the NBA, when you get ball screens, when it's not us all, having to do things in isolation and all that stuff, that's only going to help out more. And I do think that Jacoby plays well on ball and off ball. That's another big reason why I've sold him so well. Like he and Derek Queen are just the perfect teammates. When you and I were talking beforehand, I made the remark. There was in that Purdue game, there were so many times where I saw Jacoby pass and I'm like, what is he doing? And then immediately Derek Queen like appeared and the ball was in his hands. And then he kept doing it. And it's like, oh, they just have like amazing chemistry that they already know where each other one's going to be. And meanwhile, Purdue's like turning their heads around like what just happened. So that's another positive indicator where you get an NBA level teammate and you were playing like an NBA level guard with that guy. Yeah, I'm going to buy into you. And then the last thing for me, 32 assists to just 13 turnovers. Think of veteran upperclassmen, senior guards that get drafted like Malachi Flynn, Peyton Pritchard, Javon Carter, I mean, Juice McBride, all these guys, they have that in their arsenal too of like, oh, this guy takes care of the ball. That's why we should draft him at the end of the first or at the end of the second.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's like a big part of it. And I think the other thing I just love with him is his defense. Like I am very into the idea of like if you're going to be a smaller guard, there needs to be a really high level of defensive production. Like Miles McBride, Davion Mitchell, Scottie Pippen Jr., Jose Alvarado is like the obvious one. But like among those guys, like they were all guys who took on a pretty big like offensive usage load and could do all the scoring and stuff that you wanted them to do and score at multiple levels. But then they also were able to produce on the defensive end. And we've seen that out of Gillespie. So at Belmont last year, he had a 3.9 steal rate and a 1.1 block rate. He hasn't really blocked any shots this year, but the steal rate is still 3.1, which is like a really, really good number when we're talking about an NBA guard prospect. So the fact that he's at least doing that as he's scaled up in competition. And like you mentioned, he can get him at the point of attack. He's really quick with his hands. But I think he's also just like a pretty clever help defender. And I think when you are smaller, your ability to defend within a team counts. That matters a lot more. And I think because he is so fast, the ground coverage is a little bit better than it would typically be for a guy who's that short. And I love his instincts to get into passing lanes. And then also, again, like this hasn't popped up this year, but at Belmont, like he was really good at realizing like, hey, there is either like a post up or a player that's on the interior and they are not looking to pass. And I'm going to sneak in and block their shot right now. Like that is a tool that he has in his tool bag that I always really appreciate in a guard where it's like, oh, I know basketball and I know that man is not looking to pass the ball and I'm about to reject him for it. Like that is another thing that I love that we haven't really seen this year, but it's in there.
And transferring over to the Big Ten is one of the main reasons why, like, I really went in on him. So I'm like, if the finishing continues to be that good, I mean, he's playing in a conference that's all center dominator, right? And just like you mentioned, where he does a lot of things on the help, where either blocks or gets in and disrupts the post up, like all that stuff translates to the Big Ten, where once conference play comes in, like that stuff is going to show. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want me to reveal now where my final thoughts are him, but
yeah.
It's high.
Yeah. Okay. So my thing with him is like, I think he's a guy that could work his way into the top 60 next year. I'm like, I always say like, I'm Mr. Small Guard skeptical. And like, I'm even like worried about how many I like in college right now. I would say Jacoby is probably higher up on that list. I just haven't really thought about him much as like a 2025 proposition, just because I'd imagine with what he's going to make in NIL, it's probably going to be tough to get him out this year. But I do think it's important at the same time to be like, well, what would I draft the guy here? Because if I would, then you gotta rank him. So where do you see him currently?
So I think Jacoby Gillespie is a first round pick, like 21 to 30, somewhere down there. Think of like the guys I just brought up: Malachi Flynn, Peyton Pritchard, Javon Carter, Juice McBride. Like all those things check out. None of those guys finished this well. None of them did. None of them were playing. Well, let me think about this. I don't think any of them were playing with like this high level of an NBA teammate. Were
prospect. They? Pritchard may have at one point at Oregon, because I think he was young during that one really good team with like Dylan Brooks and those guys on it, maybe. And Jordan Bell.
Yeah, I forgot Dylan Brooks who went to Oregon.
Yeah, I think that might have been like his freshman year. Was Dylan Brooks, Jordan Bell, Chris Boucher, that crew.
There we go. But was he like the first starting unit guy, like being the second leading scorer?
Yeah,
the way that Jacoby Gillespie is.
No, he scored 7 points a game.
And I don't know if enough people have talked about this too. Once we get outside the lottery, I think you could really say anybody. I mean, most draft evaluators have already said this. I've heard Sam Vecini say it. I've heard a lot of y'all say it. I've heard Raphael and James Barlow say it. Of like, once you get outside the lottery, you could probably talk me into anybody once you have like the case and the numbers and the film to match it up.
Well, and I think too, like, my hot take with this class, and I hate to be like publicly negative, I'm a little bit lower on this class after like 8 than I think most people are. And I think for that reason, like there's still a lot of guys who can really make moves this year, like with strong second halves or like how well things shake out. Like I just think the data cases aren't quite as strong as I would have hoped they would be for like a large number of guys. So I think at a certain point, like, and I don't know, like I think there's, if you believe a player is going to return a certain level of value upon their pick, like if you think in a redraft, Jacoby Gillespie goes like 12, why not have him, in that, high on your board? If you can get him at, 28, why put him at 60 just because consensus says you have to have him at 60 or you have to have him, undrafted or whatever? Like, if you think that's what the value is going to be, rank him there. Why not? So I'm definitely into that. Question in the chat from Beckham Brown. I've been wondering if y'all seen Derek Queen catch and finish a lob. I've never seen it, so I'm wondering if I can. He's generally a pretty below the rim guy. I can't say that I recall one off the top of my head from this season.
I swear I've seen one at Montverde, but I haven't seen one at Maryland.
Yeah, I can't think of one at Maryland off the top of my head. A lot of it is more like, I feel like of his dunks, I'm envisioning them more as like drop-offs, or, you know what I mean? Where it's like he gets the pass and then he gets one step toward the basket. Let's see.
I mean, they run so much in the high and the mid post too. Like, they don't really put him in those situations to do that.
Yeah, it's a lot of like downhill attacking, which I think is important for the type of player that he's going to be. Like, I think for the type of player that Derek Queen's going to be, it's almost more important for me that he is dunking on like a DHO keeper than it is that he's dunking as a pick and roll lob target. Like, NBA front offices might not feel the same way. Like, NBA teams might just give me the guy who's going to finish a lob, and I get that, but I think the way that he's going about his business is fine. I like Derek.
Yeah, I mean, the comp is so easy. I've heard so many people say, and I've said it too, of like Şengün. Like, you want that guy operating in the mid and the high posts with how he can pass and move around and stuff. So why just like limit him and pick and roll? And especially, I'm sure Maryland's pitch was, hey man, we're going to let you operate where you want. We're going to make you the center point of the offense. You're not a play finisher. You are a playmaker, which is only helping his stock.
For sure. So we are going to take a quick break. We're going to come back and talk about Cincinnati Simas Lukosius. Stick with us. All right. So by the time most of you guys are listening to this, my latest article on NoCeilingsNBA.com should be up. Subscribe to the Substack. I've mentioned this every couple weeks. I'll hear from people that pick, oh yeah, I listen to podcasts. I never read the articles. Read the articles. Subscribe to NoCeilingsNBA.com. I put a ton of work into these columns. I spend a lot more work on the columns than I do in the podcast. And I put work into podcasts. You're listening to it for a reason. So make sure you subscribe to the Substack, NoCeilingsNBA.com. Simas Lukosius from Cincinnati. Fascinating player to me. So the impetus for this article is sort of my own insecurity as a draft evaluator and getting like really upset with myself when I miss on similar types of players. And I feel like the guys I undervalued in this past draft were like catch and shoot players who were really good at catching and shooting. So like Jalen Wells and Jamison Battle were the two that I mentioned in particular, where it's like, man, I was really hung up on like the finishing, the defensive production, like the rebound, like all these things. And it's like, you know what? That guy's NBA role is mostly just going to be to stand there and catch and shoot the ball and not turn it over. And those two guys have done a wonderful job of that. I think in Jalen Wells' case in particular, there has been incredible improvements like all around. Like, he is a far better defender and rebounder and things like that than he was a year ago. So credit to him there. I think Jalen Wells is a later development success story, every bit as much as he is like a guy who found a good role for him. I'm wondering if Simas Lukosius is that guy this year, more in that like Jamison Battle style tier, where like people are going to say, this guy's older. He's not super athletic. The defensive counting numbers aren't that good. He's not a great rebounder. Let's look at him as like an exhibit 10 guy. And like, I'm wondering if like this should really be more of like a priority two-way guy who, depending on how the year shakes out, like maybe he moves into that guaranteed contract category. Lukosius is draining threes this year, 48.3% from three, 14.1 attempts per 100 possessions. So this is high volume shooting. Hitting him in a variety of ways. To really, really good off of screens, really good in transition, very good spotting up, really nice like pump fake, sidestep dribble, pull up three in his arsenal as well. I think the other thing with him is in the NBA, you look at how many guys get open as a screener. Cincinnati doesn't really have him screen a ton. I think that's another way that he could be utilized because he is like 6'8", 230, I want to say. Like, he's a big, bulky dude. I think that's the way that you could use him. I just think the offensive value is like crystal clear. As far as this guy is a knockdown shooter, he can shoot off of movement. He's very good if you just want to park him and have him spot up. But he also has a really high assist total. Like he's at 3.4 assists per game to only 1.4 turnovers. He takes really good care of the ball. They're letting him run ball screens. And like the ball screen stuff it's very simple. It's I get 2 on the ball. I either hit the pop man, I hit the roll man. Occasionally like a more intermediate like kind of read. Like he's not Magic Johnson out there. But he does some really good stuff as a passer. And I just look at what role players on good teams are, and they're generally guys who shoot a lot of threes, move the ball, don't turn over, and survive on defense. So we'll start with the really positive stuff. I think this guy can really shoot the ball. I think this guy can really pass the ball. And I think that gives him like a non-zero chance to be a guy who can just play NBA minutes right away. Where are you at with Simas Lukosius?
So I'm actually disappointed in him because if anybody watched the NIT last year, he only played in 3 games. They didn't win the title. I might have given him MVP. I mean, he was just on fire. 3 games only, but he was taking 12.3 3-pointers per game, and he shot 51.4%. I mean, he just could not miss. Every game he played in the NIT, he took 10 or more threes. If you didn't see any of that film, go watch it. This is a joke. This is a joke saying I'm disappointed in him because I was like, he needs to be shooting more threes. But yeah, he's shooting a ton of threes. I don't bring up this name very often because I'm like, I don't think it's going to ever happen again. But I do see Duncan Robinson. And again, I don't throw that name out there lightly. I was at Michigan. It's a funny story. Shout out to my mom. My mom played basketball all the way to college. She's who I mostly know the game and stuff from. We went to a game, and this is like when Karis LeVert and like Zach Irvin, all these guys are on the team. And we're like sitting down watching the warm-ups and whatever. And my mom's like, I'm trying to like sell her on Zach and Karis. Like, oh, they're going to go to the NBA. And she's just like, who's that goofy? Who's a tall white guy over there? That's Duncan. He's a really good 3-point shooter. He's like, I think he's going to play in the NBA. I'm like, get out of here, lo and behold, she was right because that's all he needed to do. And the main thing too was what we see with Simas is that he can shoot in a variety of situations and he doesn't need the ball. I think that's where he's the most dangerous is when he's running off like pin downs and doing stuff off ball and at that size. I've always seen him listed at 6'6", so I don't know.
Cincinnati's website has him at 6'8".
Yeah, Basketball Reference has him at 6'6", so I don't know. But even if he's 6'6", that's again a mismatch shooter, and there's no doubt he's like 220, 230.
He's big
at that
he's
size.
Very bulky.
Like that creates a ton of mismatch. And if an NBA team is like, oh, we should probably screen him more, then that opens him up for so many other things. I mean, I always see and evaluate drafts through a Pistons lens since I'm a Pistons fan and half of the podcast is Pistons. And this is the guy that we've screamed forever that we need with Cade and with an Ivy is just some dude who runs off pin downs, runs off like, different screens and curls and just shoots threes. And Cade and Ivy find them wherever. What NBA team doesn't need that? Right? Like that's the sell. And I'm going to bring up some bad things too. Like I hate his rebounding numbers. They're really bad. And the defensive stuff, like, I don't know, but he's a one where you just got to study the film and you realize, yes, every last single team needs this. And even who you brought up, like Jamison Battle, who I was really high on and thought should have been a second round pick. Like Jamison was just like, stand there and I'll feed you and shoot threes. Like, if he could do half of the movement stuff that Simas could, then he probably would have gotten drafted. And being the big guy that Simas is too, you think like, he's not going to move around. But no, like he probably covers more ground than anybody on that Cincinnati team. Part of the reason why he's leading the team in points right now.
Yeah, I was really surprised by how well he moved off of screens. Like just like
everybody is going to think like, it's the fat kid that doesn't want to move, right? But he's not.
yeah, like as a surprisingly high work rate player. Like it's not like if you look at Ben Shepherd junior year at Belmont, like he did not stop running the entire game. Like it's not quite that level, but just his stop start speed when he gets going from like I'm standing to I am now running along the baseline and then curling off the screen. Like that speed is quite a bit better than I would have thought it was. He's not Jacoby Gillespie in terms of speed, but he doesn't need to be. And I think that what he has there is really functional. So let's get into some of the more like concerning stuff. So The rebounding is like bad. He rebounds like a guard. Like 0.81 defensive rebounding rate this year. Career defensive rebounding rates around 12. Like, I think part of that is schematic. I think part of it's like we've got Bendiago, we've got Dylan Mitchell, like just get out in transition. But like even on the offensive glass, it's really low. Like 5.3 offensive rebound rate this year is like high, but I think that's like an outlier just based on where he's been historically on that front. So like when we are talking about NBA players, like rebounding is just a much more important indicator than I think it gets credit for at times. And even the more like snipery guys, like Luke Kennard had better defensive rebounding numbers than Simas has. Like that's kind of what we're working with here. See, if you're saying, well, for the archetype, it's not that important. It's like, yeah, but I feel better if he had like more rebounds per game than Sam Merrill did. Like if he was rebounding at a better clip than Sam Merrill, that would be nice. So that's definitely a little weird. Like Sam Hauser was like a guy who like was all over the defensive glass in college, and like Simas, like you never really want to like comp guys to Sam Hauser. Like I feel like it's always dangerous to be like he's exactly like the guy who was the absolute best at this archetype. Like I don't want to do that. I don't think that's fair. But like with Hauser, it was like, yeah, like a lot of similar stuff, like really good decision maker, like really good, like grab and go, like you get him out in transition. He could shoot off the dribble a little bit. It's like, I would like it if Simas like tried to get into that stuff the way that Hauser could, but he just doesn't really do it.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up what I was going to say with Bendiago and Dylan Mitchell. I kind of feel like the instruction is clear out for those guys, because if they don't do that, what else do they bring to the table? No shade at them. They're both great dudes that do stuff in the paint, both on offense and on defense. Dylan can do more perimeter defense and stuff on the defensive side, but that's like what they have to do and where they succeed at. So I feel like part of it is that, but the rebound numbers have just never been great for Simas, like throughout his entire college career. Part of it's because he is playing as a big guard rather than as a forward. So I think that's part of like what to think about too. But even then, like you said, there's guards, Sam Merrill, and all these dudes that have rebounded better than this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just like an interview thing where like you got to get him in an interview and be like, dude, why are you not rebounding better?
Yeah.
And like pull up a bunch of clips to play with him of like what's going through your mind here. What are you doing that? And again, part of why I bring up the Duncan Robinson again, which I hate doing that when you're like you just said, the exact best of the archetype, but it does remind me of that where it's just like it didn't matter for Duncan because he just had to find the exact team that fit that role. And one of the tiers I always give in my big board is future Miami Heat undrafted all-star.
Yeah.
And like this is one of those guys to where it seems like that would be the case, to where they're like, Duncan's getting kind of old. Let's bring in Simas and have him do the exact same thing. And the rest of the league is like, why did we allow this to happen?
Yeah.
But I think if you bring him into a situation where like the team is a bad rebounding team and they're going to play him at forward, then that's going to be more of an issue for sure.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. Let's talk about the defense with him. This year, the numbers are actually like a little bit better. Like he's got a 2.1 steal rate so far. It is early. They have not had the hardest schedule so far. I understand the concerns with like, if he doesn't measure well, it could get ugly. Like if his wingspan is like 6'6", 6'7", 6'8", somewhere in there, it's definitely a little bit trickier. I thought his defensive tape was like a lot more encouraging than I expected it to be. He's really engaged off the ball. Like he is very, very ready for things to happen and ready to react. I thought his balance was a little better than I expected. I thought his footwork and his defensive stance were a little better than I expected. And I thought just like in general, he did a pretty good job of like staying in front of the ball and maximizing his size to make guys uncomfortable. He is never probably going to be a plus defender. Like I don't like this guy's not going to make an all defense team. But he's guarded 9 isolation possessions this year and only given up 2 points. So like, I just think when you're that big, it's a little bit harder to get hunted if you can move just to the level that he can, where like, it's fine. And off the ball, he's communicating, he's pointing, he's talking. Like, there are going to be problems. Like, he is never going to be a guy who can like he's going to be really limited if he's like the low man defensively. Because like he's not going to come over and like even really force guys to alter shots at the rim, like let alone like come over from the weak side and fly in and block something like Aaron Gordon or whatever. Like that's not there. He does not have the stop-start burst to like get into passing lanes. He does not have recovery tools. Like there are like real issues that are going to hold him back and make things difficult for him defensively. But I think everything that you could realistically hope for in this type of player defensively is there. Between just like the instincts, the give a damn, like that stuff is there.
Yeah, for defensive limited guys, I think I've come around to just like how big are they? Mm-hmm. If they're over 6'5", if they're over like 220, then that's a whole another category to where even if they're like they still are big enough to get in the way. I mean, the list is long of dudes in the NBA that are backups that do that just because they have size. And the NBA takes time to develop them, where maybe there's a dude that was like 6'4" that cared a little bit more, but they're like, we're not going to waste time because it's really not going to make that big of a difference, even if they increase their defense like a little bit. So that's just something for me to think about with that is like, yeah, he's big. And like you said, he cares. So why not invest in that at like, we're not talking like, lottery or in the first round.
No. Like second round value play here.
Yeah, exactly. Or like your priority undrafted free agent, like you're on the phone with him as the second round is ending. Like that's definitely something to consider there. And context is key for a player like this. Again, I can only think of my Pistons who in that second unit, they have Ron Holland, Sar Thompson, Isaiah Stewart, and then Jaden Ivey like runs the point. What does that lineup need? It just needs that dude that runs off screens and shoots threes and doesn't do anything else. And what do all those other guys do? Oh, they're fantastic defenders that can switch everything except for Ivey, who needs to turn around, but I mean, he's not the defender like a Sar, Ron, and Stu are. If you put Simas in that lineup, he's fine. Like none of that stuff matters because all those other guys want to grab rebounds and run and do the dirty stuff on defense. And then Simas is guarding like the worst guy in a backup NBA unit, which I would be more uncomfortable. Like, I think I'd be fine with that.
Yeah. And like for me, it's always like the Sixers and the Bulls are probably the two teams I watch the most of. And like the Bulls have just like, I've just been like dying for them to sign like one guy who's 6'8" period. Like over the last decade, like we just love guys that are 6'4" and it drives me nuts. But like obviously I think he's a fit there. But then like even within the Sixers context for me, it's like, could you give him like 8-9 minutes to run throughout the game, like during the minutes where Embiid is on the floor? And like the Sixers aren't a team that shoot a ton of threes, and like they desperately could use some like bigger guys that are more spot up oriented just to space out the floor, give Maxey space to attack the basket, and things like that. Or like if Embiid wants to be in the post for a little bit, like they can, like a lot of teams could just use a guy like this is what I think it comes back to. It is like the most malleable plug and play type of thing that you could hope for. And I think at the same time, like in something I mentioned in the article, is like you want to be careful about like, you still need to extrapolate for higher end outcomes, right? Like you still need to be like, well, is this guy like ever going to be someone who attacks the basket in the playoffs? Like things like that. Like those things matter. And that's why we're not talking about him within that lottery context. But as far as like a guy who can play and then like maybe that leads to development and that turns into something else, like that's really something that you could, I think, roll the dice on in the second. So I came away like I entered it pretty skeptical, but like, hey, this is an archetype that I've missed on, so I need to take a hard look at this guy. And I came away liking his game a lot more than I expected to in terms of just the overall picture outside of what he's great at. We're going to take a quick break here, and then we're going to be back on the other end. It's going to be the Sickos session, so stay tuned for some Magoon, Gwath, and Michael Rataj. We'll be right back with you. All right, so the guy that you brought up, I was so excited that you brought up when we were talking about guys to talk about on the podcast. That is Magoon, Gwath at San Diego State. They have a great team. We've talked about Miles Bird on this podcast pretty recently. Gwath is fascinating. He is 7 feet tall. He is very skinny. He blocks every single shot that takes place during the course of the game. He has an 18.4 block rate, like bordering on like Walker Kessler territory, which very few guys step into. And he can shoot a little bit. He is taking 5 threes per 100 possessions. He's hitting 47.1% of them. Very interesting player. What made you want to bring up Magoon Gwath as your sicko prospect for this week?
Maybe the shot blocking and 3-point shooting. I mean, everybody's looking for the shot blocking, 3-point shooting center. He hasn't taken a lot of threes so far. He's only taken like 1.9 3-point attempts per game.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it was something that he profiled. Shout out to John Rothstein, too, who always goes on this tour when the preseason begins, and he'll kind of throw out names. I remember last year he was like, everybody needs to pay attention to Keyshawn George in like, September, October, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And Magoon Gwath was one of the names that came up when he went to San Diego State. It was like, yeah, this guy can shoot, looks legit, and definitely is a shot blocker. I mean, the counting stats in terms of points and everything else aren't going to look that great, but the archetype is there. I mean, this guy didn't work out in the NBA, but this is what everybody wanted. Alexandra Pokashevsky,
sure.
Kind of what they wanted him to look like, because he can move like that. Definitely couldn't handle the way Poku could, but the shot looks fine. He's already settled into a role here at San Diego State. He is starting for them, I believe. So he started all 9 games. And San Diego State's schedule is not easy. It's one of the things I've always liked about San Diego State. I don't know when it started. Maybe it started under Steve Fisher, but a long time ago, they decided we're going to take like the best of the best in these non-conference games. And that's what's going to help us like take the step forward. I mean, they played Gonzaga, they played Creighton, they played Oregon, they played Houston, and they played UC San Diego and California Baptist, who are all like pretty good college basketball teams.
There's no like California school for nursing and mining. Like, as I was like, this is like my made up like in-state school name. It's like a Division III. You know what I mean? Like, there's none of those.
How dare you disparage California School of Nursing and Mining?
Yeah.
And I mean, Magoon Gwath in these games too, against Gonzaga, he had 5 blocks. Against Creighton, he had 2 blocks. Against Oregon, he had 5 blocks. And against Houston, he also had 5 blocks. I'm pretty sure they're still seeing him in their nightmares. All these teams definitely took them by surprise. And I think the Houston game was really like one where if I'm Kelvin Sampson, shout out Kelvin Sampson, by the way, Lumbee tribe. So Res Ball still represented there in college basketball. If I'm Kelvin Sampson that game, I'm like, yeah, we need guys that are bigger, because even though Gwath still has strength concerns and whatever, his length and height like really gave them problems. So yeah, been great on the defensive end. Only taken 17 threes, but 8 of 17 right now. The concern, I don't know if you want to get into concerns or you want to stick on the positive. So, I mean, the concern is 190. You already know what it is. Like, can he finish very well? The answer so far is no. He's only shooting 54.5% at the rim on 11 shots. He's only taken 9 shots in the paint, shooting 4 of 9 there for 44.4%. He's not exactly getting a ton of rebounds either. He's only pulled in 28. I think that's probably the more concerning part.
That's the one.
Like the finishing, yeah, sure. But at the same time, you're like, if he's going to be like a stretch 5, like there are plenty of guys beforehand that you're like, I don't know if these guys finish well, and they end up being more of a 3-point shooter. And this is probably somebody that, like, if everything pans out and like somebody takes a chance on him, the sell is we'll keep him on the perimeter and do that stuff. But everything we brought up with Simas, I mean, it's like that times 10. If you're going to be a power forward or center and you're only pulling in 3.1 rebounds, I mean, like Nick Boyd, BJ Davis, Miles Bird, they're all rebounding better than him. And they're all like almost, some of these guys are like a foot shorter than he is almost.
Yeah.
So that's concerning. That's the more concerning part of it. It's like, okay, the finishing, maybe it'll come around. But if you're not going to get on the glass as a big, like, it's a hard sell.
That's the thing to me is, so like there are skinny dudes who've rebounded well in college. And even the ones that like haven't rebounded super well, rebounded a lot better than this. So the defensive rebounding is really poor, 8.9 defensive rebound rate, which again, like those are guard numbers. So like if we look at like really bad defensive rebounding rates for like bigger guys, they are more perimeter oriented. Like it's like a Luke Cornett kind of guy, like a Laurie Marketing kind of guy. But even a guy like Derek Lively was like a pretty poor rebounder in college, like a guy who's really skinny, like a Jackson Hayes. Like I wish it was better. I really wish it was better. And it's the one thing that's like holding me back from going really wild as far as like where I rank him, is the fact that like
same.
He really can't affect anything on the glass at this point. And this isn't a case too where it's like, yes, he is fluid defensively. Yes, he's out on the perimeter at times, but also like if you're around the basket enough to block 3.4 shots per game, you should be able to grab more rebounds per game than 3.1. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you should not be blocking more shots than you rebound. Like, just by virtue of having that length, I needed to grab a couple more than that. The finishing, I'm a little more optimistic with, just because I think like the guys who I tend to buy into as finishers that aren't finishing well now are guys with really good athletic traits that still just have to like fill out their body. And even like guys that aren't like, I'm trying to think of examples off the top of my head, but there's been a lot of guys like Jaylen Brown, for example, was like a really poor finisher in college. And I think some guys that are just young and that like toolsy and explosive, it just takes them a little while to like get the coordination and touch element of it down. So I tend not to sweat guys that are poor finishers with really good tools that don't have like broken touch, which we don't think Gwath has. Like he's solid free throw shooter, looks really comfortable shooting it from the 3-point line. But and like I also think too, like there's a thing of like he's not like great from a ball skill standpoint. So like if he's going to be a 4, you want to see more of that. But again, like one thing I just keep coming back to is like skill set rarity. And like every team wants a 3-and-D big. The problem is like they don't exist very often. Like there are so few that are legitimately guys who can anchor a defense and protect a rim and actually be a threat to shoot the ball. Like even if you look at a guy like Miles Turner, like the Miles Turner closeout experience isn't like, oh my God, we've got to get to Miles Turner and block this shot. Like teams are just like, yeah, he might it. He might not. Like there are very few like Kristaps Porzingis level guys where it's like, he is a threat to shoot that ball. He is a threat to block your shot when you come in the paint. And I am not saying Magoon Gwath is going to be Kristaps Porzingis or Brook Lopez or any of these guys, but I'm just saying there's very few of them. And I think at a certain point in the draft, and I think that point is quite a bit higher than a lot of other people might in this class, I could see looking at Magoon Gwath and just being like, this is going to take a few years, but like, let's try it. Like, let's just go for it. There are so few guys that are this tall that move this well that like can shoot. And he has an elite trait already as a shot blocker. I think Magoon Gwath is a guy, and I'm like Mr. like, I would say when it comes to like first round picks, especially in this environment, I'm pretty like, yeah, teams are going to want guys that can play right away. Like you've got to be pretty conservative, but like you've got to really have a plan. You do really have to have a plan. I think you could reasonably take Magoon Gwath at the end of the first. Like, I think that's a completely reasonable thing for a team to do. Is there a chance that like ends in disaster? Yes. But I also think like, who are the 7-footers that shoot like this? And again, the sample is really small. Like this is a thing that we might come back to in 2 months and he's at like 22% from 3. And they're like, hey, remember when you said Magoon Gwath is a guy you'd consider in the first? Like this could completely blow up. It could go super awry, but I see a guy with like a really good physical runway ahead of him to fill out his frame. I see elite shot blocking and I see a potentially rare shooting skill set for a big guy. And I think that's like a really intriguing bet.
I mean, I'm right there with you in terms of like this could end up in the first round, but I think 2 things have to happen. The rebounding obviously has to get better. And like screening, something in screening. Like if you could just show stuff in DHO or like as pick and pop threat, they do more of those things. Then it's like, all right, we see how this works and it's all good. But even if he doesn't, I still think like, I don't know, 35, 55, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Like it's like absolutely 100% reasonable to be like, yes, let's take the chance on this guy. And when we're talking about shot blocking, I believe he's second in the entire Division I NCAA with that block percentage. And again, look at the teams I just laid out that they played. It's not like they've played, as James and Raphael Barlow said, the directional schools, you know, like South, Northeastern, Western State, you know, or whatever it is. They played top 10, top 25 teams, 4 of them at least. So he's doing this against some of the best competition there is out there. It's why we're like, yeah, as a shot blocker, he's a different kind of guy. And then if the shooting continues to show, then yes, absolutely take a chance on this guy, as well as the movement skills. I can't help but think of somebody like Chris Boucher, who doesn't shoot as well as this, but like that's the reason why Chris Boucher has stayed so long. It's like, sure, he's skinnier, he's not as tall as Magoon Gwath, but he still fills that role. And even him with the shooting, like it doesn't quite work out, but he hits enough of them, and he's carved out a nice, like almost decade-long career here in the NBA.
Yeah, and I think like is like a fail safe. Like you could have far worse outcomes than Chris Boucher. So the guy I want to talk about tonight is Michael Rataj, who is at Oregon State. I'm doing a spreadsheet sleepers column on No Ceilings Plus, so I'll have kind of more in-depth thoughts over there. Rataj is like a really interesting guy to me. So his usage is insane. So he is a 6'9", 220-pound forward at Oregon State. So this is the guy who like has just like NBA physical dimensions. He has a 29.3 usage rate this year. And I think what makes Rataj so interesting is the things that he is doing with that usage burden. So even with that, he's like rebounding like a center. He's got a 9.6 offensive rebound rate, 24.8 defensive rebound rate, 4.4 steal percentage, 4.8 block percentage, which are like Tari Eason numbers. And like, he's not Tari as an athlete, like not even close. But he's a really smart defensive player who knows how to use his length, knows how to read the game, like really good instincts as far as like knowing when he can get to what I call gray area blocks, where it's like, I'm going to sneak up behind a guy in the mid range and block his shot. Good weak side help, really good getting into people's handles at the point of attack. And then offensively, like there's just enough interesting stuff. He's taking 6.2 threes per 100 possessions, 37% on those threes. But it's developed like a really nice face-up game. He was kind of post-up oriented in the past. This year, he's sort of like leading the offense. He's really turnover prone, which is like the only thing that's stopping me from being like, Michael Rataj, it's time. Like that, like we need another year. We need another year, 6.7 turnovers per 100 possessions. And like I was texting Nathan Grubel about this yesterday. Like the guys that I've missed on in recent years were all guys who turned it over too much for their like role and position. It was guys like Jalen Hood-Schifino. There was somebody else. Like Max Lewis was like a guy that I loved. Like, I think when the turnovers are like really high, it's something that's pretty hard to turn around. And like, that's my concern with Rataj. It's like, is he just too turnover prone? But then I just come back to like that usage burden is so big, and it has never been big in the past. He was a sub 20 usage guy this year, who's now scratching like a 30% usage rate. And I just wonder, like, 6'9", awesome rebounding, awesome defensive playmaking, enough of a handle, enough of a catch and shoot game that it's like, if we just like trim the mistakes out of this, like that's a role player. I think most likely he settles into like two-way territory. Like the remark I made in the column is like, if you told me he went in the draft this year, I think he'd settle somewhere between like where Enrique Freeman went on a two-way and like Tristan Enaruna being like the best guy to get an E10. Like, I think he's like somewhere in that tier, but I think just like a 6'9" guy who's this productive despite having to do everything on offense. Like, I'm really intrigued.
We're going to disagree on this one.
Okay,
like I spent
that's
a
fair.
lot of time on the film. A couple things that we said with other players of like, oh, look at the schedule they played. Well, look at the schedule that Oregon State have played so far. They played Utah Tech, Weber State, Western Oregon, who, by the way, doesn't even show up in sports references database.
Yeah.
They're like D2, right? Cal State, Fullerton, Oregon, which was a great game. If you haven't watched that game, definitely go watch that game. That was a good one. Rataj could have won the game at the end. He had that three open. I felt for him, man. It was right there. North Texas, which probably is
good
his worst
team,
game. We'll
but
get into that in a
not
minute.
a good game. Yeah.
UC Davis, Idaho, and then UC Irvine. So
and he had 4 turnovers yesterday against UC Irvine. So like the turnover thing, like we come back to that again. It's like, this isn't like, oh, Oregon like made him do a ton with the ball and it was a rough one. It was like, no, like this is an every game issue for him. But in the Oregon game, though, it was 20 and 10 with 3 assists, 2 blocks, and a steal. Like, he had a really good game.
He was fantastic. But it's one game. This is why I'm like, I like I can never let one game against good competition like sway me. Totally. This is somebody who's never produced this kind of offense before. I mean, last year was his career high of 8.3 points per game. He's never been a 3-point shooter. Well, I guess technically you say he was a good 3-point shooter as a freshman. He only took 1.6, but last year 28.8%. The free throw numbers have been all over the place, which is one of the things to me
Yes.
that I'm always like, ooh, I really don't know how to rate your shooting when you're 59% from the line as a freshman, 73 from the line as a sophomore, and then not currently 90% now. I'm like, kudos to the
Yeah, if that's development, awesome. But like,
cool.
I don't know that that's development with the sample that we have yet. Yeah,
and this is something I'll have to do in the future because I've pulled some names and what you used to talking about how you missed on certain players I missed on. It was that pattern where like the numbers, the shooting numbers in particular, were like up and down all over the place. It was like maybe it has to do with things like the teammates that were around him, or like he just got on a hot streak one year. I mean, everything to me, not saying Rataj isn't skilled in everything. I'll give you his shooting numbers and shot chart and stuff here in a minute. I just think he's one of those guys that it's like you have to wait and see on him. I don't think I would put him on
I think that's
big board.
Yeah,
just for that is like when somebody hasn't produced this way and all of a sudden they're the lead scorer. For me, it's like you got to see what they look like against their division, their conference. I mean, this is where I've gotten burned a lot. Like I was so in on Milan Momcilovic last year, and the other guy. Who's the other guy last year?
The other one that I always think about last year was Otega Owe. Was the guy who was averaging like 16 points per game on like 80, 70, 59 splits. It's like, wait, what's going on with that free throw thing? And then he scored like 3 points per game down the stretch. But he's been really good this year. But like,
and the other one,
every year there's a couple of these.
I think Keontae George was the other one his year where non-conference play, he looked awesome. And then when he got into conference play, and this was what I was trying to say with Milan last year, like their conference play numbers were just pitiful. If they averaged that all year, like people would be like, they're not an NBA player. Part of why the
JD Davison
went back last year
was another one of those too, where JD Davison was like posting near triple doubles, and then like conference play gets there, and it's like,
and for somebody like Rataj, it's like, okay, cool that he's gotten this now. Now when he gets into his conference, like that's when the real test starts because you have all this extra time. When the new year, the coaches go and study a bunch of film. They say, here are the tendencies from these guys we've seen in non-conference. You see a lot of teams multiple times, so they know how to adjust to you and things like that. And then the turnovers, oh my gosh, that North Texas game. I feel bad because Rataj was the only one that could score. Like everybody else.
That's the thing that's my hope is that it's just like maybe
seven turnovers. I mean, he lost them the game. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was bad. It was bad.
That was such a low scoring game too. I think it was like 57-55 or something. Like that's one of those games where you got to go on the film and be like, simple. Just keep it simple next time. And that's the thing too with Rataj. I feel like he does some fancy stuff every now and then. I'm just like, bro, like just dump the ball off to the center, don't pass behind your back or stuff like that.
That was the thing too, is like the turnovers, like this might sound odd. With certain guys, I prefer if the turnover is like one type of thing. But with Rataj, it's like, oh, that was like a happy feet travel. Oh, that was you stepped out of bounds in the corner. Oh, that one was an illegal screen. Oh, that one was you dribbled into traffic. That one was you tried to do too fancy of a pass. It's just like, it's an overall issue and not just like, it's this one thing that he's just got to stop doing. Like part of the reason I was optimistic about Max Lewis coming out was that with Max Lewis, it was always the happy feet travel. It was always, I caught it and I went to do a catch and go. And I moved my feet too quickly before I did that. I got called for a turnover. It's like, we just got to stop doing that thing. And then this will get better. Where with Rataj, it's like, it's a lot of stuff that needs to be pared down. But my hope is I really like how the shot looks. I'm encouraged by the free throw shooting improvements year over year. And I'm thinking like if he can just be a 6'9", like catch and shoot dude that rebounds and makes stuff happen on defense, then like we're cooking. But even like with the defense, like the defensive playmaking metrics are really high this year too, compared to the past.
Yeah.
So like that's something like those numbers are doubled. So it is going to be conference play to your point.
Again, wait and see for him because he falls into a couple different categories. The other category he falls into me for is I'm the tallest guy on the team, so I guess I'm playing center when it's not going to be his NBA position, so that's part of it. But I mean, his shot chart does look pretty good. He's 0 of 1 from the corners. He's 9 of 24 from above the break threes, which is 37.5%. He's shooting 62.5% of the mid range. It's only 16 shots, but I mean that seems to be one of his go-to moves. Doing a bunch of stuff. Still all those post-up stuffs you said before. I think that has helped him in terms of development. And then 50% in the paint, 9 of 18. The only area where he's really struggling is at the rim, 16 of 33, 48.5%. But again, to me, I'm always like, if you're the tallest guy on the court and you have to play center, even though you're not a center, I always give grace to that part. And like, I'm
Sure.
not going to really count those numbers because it's like in the NBA, everybody's playing with 7-foot guys. And even if you're not playing with 7-foot guys, you're playing with like Draymond Green and Steph Curry, something that can make up for it. And having to do like that's the area where I would say like the offensive load is too much for him. And that's where it's probably affecting him the most. He doesn't have a screener who can like take pressure or put pressure on the rim. He's not playing with a lob threat that can do that. Like he's
because
pretty much
like a very below the rim guy. Yeah,
he's like the only guy putting pressure on the rim consistently and having to create his own shot and having a great shot for others and stuff. So I do think there's like a definite role player power forward in there. And like you said, scale. This is where I do agree with you. Is like scale back. Sure.
Yes.
I kind of feel like he needs to be like Pete Nance or somebody where he did really well as the guy at Northwestern, then transferred over somewhere to be a role player next year. That would be my hope for him because I do think he would, if he transferred over somewhere and actually got a role and they actually played him, like he would excel at it.
Yeah. And to your point about conference play too, like we're going to get to see some really good matchups for him this year. Like we'll get them against St. Mary's, Washington State, San Fran, Gonzaga, like Santa Clara, which is like the best 6-5 team in the country by a lot. Like there's some good teams that they're gonna have to play against that have like forward size dudes that are like bigger guys that can give them a little bit something physically, but also still like enough of a skill set where it's like you're gonna have to like guard Ben Gregg out to the perimeter. Like Michael Ajayi is NBA strong. Like there's going to be things that he has to deal with in these matchups that are going to be like an interesting litmus test as far as like where he actually is. So yeah, we'll wrap it right there. Steve, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people follow you and read all your stuff and listen to your podcasts?
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much for having me on here. Always wanted to be on the Draft Sickos podcast, as that's what I consider myself as well. So you can follow me on any social media platform, Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads. I'm on Twitter now. I'm probably going to get off Twitter here in a minute, though, at ResballPod on every single one of them. We occasionally show up on YouTube, but every week we do a Pistons pod with Andy, a.k.a. David, Piston fan. And No Ceilings own Jam Hines and I have been doing the draft show for quite a while every single week, bi-weekly, at least twice a month. I'll be doing some more solo stuff here with the draft stuff, including the next episode where I'm going to talk about some early season takes that probably will get you into some trouble if you're going to make them, but it's fun to talk about that stuff.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Like I said, I've been a fan of Steve's work for a long time, so make sure you're following him. Listen to the Resball Pod. It's really good stuff. Follow me at Boundboards on Twitter and Blue Sky, NoCeilingsNBA.com for all of our written content, No Ceilings NBA on your podcast app of choice and YouTube channel. Like the video, subscribe wherever you're listening or watching this. We really appreciate it. Helps our metrics, helps you'll find us. And I think that'll do it. So we'll see you all next time. Have a great rest of your day.
Read the articles, people. Come on.
Yeah, read the articles.